Kenner presents new alien action figure.
Bayman's glow! Quick, shut the airlock! The alien's locked out now! He got through! Shh! Give up! Alien can't be beat! We'll zap him with the light! Don't, he'll destroy the spaceship! We've lost! Better find another ship! Let's try the kitchen! Another triumph for Alien!
Alien action figure. New from Kenner.
Hi everyone and welcome once again to Geek Fest Rants. My name is Carlos Perron and joining me today I have James. Say hi, James.
Hello, hello.
Today we are going to do another one of our toy shows. However, this time around we are not focusing so much, actually we're focusing very little on Kenner or Hasbro, which are some of our favorite toy lines, obviously because of Star Wars connection, the big Star Wars connection. But as James and I remember fondly, in the 70s and 80s, which, it's when we were kids, there were a lot of action figures out there. Obviously, not a lot of them very successful. And quality-wise, compared to Kenner, big difference. Kenner was the big boy, when it comes to good-looking figures back then. Nowadays, Kenner, if it was put out today, it could not, I don't think, compete. The quality of material that you see these days, it's amazing what they do these days.
Well, the way they're going back, you could possibly compete because I think they're going retro themselves.
Yeah, for different reasons, for financial reasons. But there were other companies back then that had certain licenses, similar to how Star Wars had a deal with Kenner, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. And let's kind of back into this conversation because what happened was, I would say about maybe 2-3 years ago, while I was visiting one of the conventions I usually go to, whether it was a Celebration convention or a New York Comic Con, I don't remember exactly which one. Might have even
been Toy Fair.
Could have been Toy Fair, you're right. There was a company who was promoting something they were putting together. And what they were putting together was, basically, it would appear as if they had found or gotten their hands on somehow on prototypes, which might have belonged to Kenner at the time, of a few action figures about the movie Alien from 1979.
Now, have we established as fact that there was possibly going to be a line of Kenner Alien figures?
I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, it seems like it, but I can't quite personally verify it either.
Yeah, I don't think they just pulled these figures out of their butt and say, hey, guess what, everybody, look what we have. No, there was something I remember them, advertising, not so much advertising, but promoting the fact that these were prototypes that somebody was about to manufacture, and for whatever reason they didn't. Now, granted, the movie was Alien. It's an R-rated film back in the 70s, and traditionally, even these days, these days you can get away with a lot more, but even back then, nobody really wants to merchandise an R-rated film. It's very difficult.
Because your main target audience wasn't allowed legally to go see it.
Right, you're not even allowed into the theater. Even though they did end up putting out, I remember they put out a large alien creature, like really big, like a foot
18 inches, I think.
Foot and a half, 2 feet long. It was pretty big. But it was more of like a collector item.
It was mildly posable, but I think it was more for like the people who were collecting the monsters, Universal monsters and stuff.
It was pretty nice. I remember it was very nice looking. I remember it, but it was a time I hadn't seen the movie and I didn't, want to spend the money on it. But anyway, so apparently somebody at some point wanted to make Star Wars-y type of action figures for that movie. So this company somehow got their hands on the rights to do it, and they were starting all the prep work and the promotion work and all the legwork basically. And in each of these conventions I would attend, they would have a little display area and they were showing you what they're going to look like when they put them out. Obviously, it was a very collector niche type of thing. It wasn't the type of thing that you would probably see at a Toys R Us or a KB at the time.
Now, have you explained basically what the Star Wars style figure is? 5 points.
Well, let's go. Why don't you talk about that just a little bit? Because we have talked about it before when we talked about some of our earlier Star Wars toy shows, but the standard, talk about what the standard was back then.
Before Star Wars came along, the action figure tended to be all over the place. There were the Mego style, which were very popular with the superheroes and some of the popular shows and movies of the day, which were in the 8-inch ballpark. Right. They were a plastic head, softer plastic head that actually probably looked like the character was supposed to be, as
like
best
a rubbery
as they could.
Type of head. Yeah.
If you think of the original Star Trek figures, they had a Shatner look to it. They had a Leonard Nimoy look to it. It was nice. Some of the movie characters, some of the human characters look good. Superhero characters you got away with because they were basically guys in masks, or if it was Superman, it just basically had to be a guy with dark hair and a little curl. So they were easy. And then they had cloth uniforms on of whatever their style of, if it was the Batcape and cowl or if it was the, Star Trek Enterprise crew uniform, stuff like that. There was also a couple companies that made larger size. Kenner did have some figures, and their size were about the 12-inch size, and that was like $6 Million Man. LJN, I believe, had some. That might have been the emergency style figures, which were almost a copy of the Mego figures. And then, of course, Hasbro had G.I. Joe.
The godfather of all the boy toys.
And the G.I. Joe line was very, very popular for many years. And there were derivatives of that called Big Jim and the Action Pack and, Action Man, I think, was the British version of G.I. Joe. And so, to go along with the Barbie style, which were they were about 12-inch size. Maybe Barbie was a little smaller. Anyway, so you had these all over the spectrum. And then there were some Japanese companies, making metal type figures. So Kenner chose the Star Wars size because they said, okay, what could fit in a spaceship? And if they picked 3 3/4 inches to be the approximate 6-foot man, then they could work everything up and down, the taller characters, the shorter characters, have a standard, make toys and spaceships and play sets that were manageable and cost efficient that people could afford. So that's what we mean by the Star Wars style, the Star Wars standard. And that standard became a 5-point articulation. Arms, up and down, legs, front and back, and head turning. And there was basically no waist, no arms. That kind of stuff came much later. There were little improvements made on the smaller G.I. Joes, then other figures made improvements until we are where we today, where you have tons of cloth goods, tons of guns, detachable and reattachable hands for different poses, and it just gets nuts. So the Star Wars style is what we're talking about, these alien figures looking like that, and some of the figures going forward were in that category.
Right. And what this company is apparently doing is they're putting out, and they have, as a matter of fact, you gave me a set of alien figures,
and that was a nice gift, wasn't it?
I know. After about, I think maybe 2 to 3 years of them, revving up for it, they finally put them out. And from what I understand, they're distributing them as, for private collectors, through collector shops, online, that sort of thing, not the Toys R Us chain type of purchase. And they not only use the style of like we said before, the Kenner style. Even on their cards, they almost imitate the Kenner logo in a way, but they put their own name on it, which they're called Reaction.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, they're a combination of 2 companies, Super 7 and Funko. They kind of got together for this.
I love the look of them. When I heard about them, I thought, well, this is interesting but weird that they're doing this so many years later. But now that I've physically seen them in my hands, they are great. They are really, really nice. And Alien's the type of movie that deserves them because it's from that same era.
Exactly. And unfortunately, because it was R-rated, it missed out on a lot of the merchandisable aspects of it that today it would go insane over, even if it was R-rated. Now, when we got these toys, we started thinking back and having conversations about, wow, wouldn't it be great if they did this for a lot of other lines and stuff like that? And then we started going over some of these old lines that used to exist, and it was like, oh, wait a minute. Why did they ever bother making some of these? Some of these are so unusually, I don't want to say inappropriate, but kind of like unpromotable, unmerchandisable type of stuff that, Star Trek is Star Trek. You can't get away from Star Trek. As you said before, first you had the larger cloth type of dolls. Then with, I believe, the motion picture, they put out an actual 3 3/4 size-ish kind of wave, but it did have the articulation of your traditional Mego.
Let's go over a couple of them. So Star Wars comes out, it's around late 77, you get the Early Bird set coming out. Around early 78, I get my first package from the Early Bird set. The ball is in motion. Anything could happen now. So we know what's coming next. Okay, we've got Star Trek. The motion picture is coming down the line. Remember them?
Oh, yeah.
Now, they were a little inferior to the Star Wars figures. They tended to have a nice look and really nice costumes, but their paint jobs were more shiny, and they had these little pins in them that looked like to help make the articulation, and the arms went up and down.
Well, that's a standard of that particular company.
And that was Mego.
That was Mego.
That was the modern Mego.
It's
Mego
like a little screw, like a screw in the elbows.
Now, you can identify right away, but to me, it always was like, geez, they didn't try hard enough, or something like that, because the Star Wars figures looked as good as they needed to be. And they, these other ones, as much as they had a little bit more posability, I suppose.
But that's the problem. In order to give them more than 5 points, you sacrifice quality in terms of having to stare at the screw and at the joints.
So Star Wars made 2 different scales. They eventually made 3 different scales if you count the micro metal ones that they did a few years later. But they do a 12-inch line. They do a 3 3/4-inch line. Star Trek does the same thing. Now the Star Trek 12-inch line, they're beautiful. They're really nice costumes. The heads are nicely done. But they only did a handful. I think they only did maybe 4, if at the most 5. We could look it up. That's what the internet's for. You guys can verify all that.
But that's kind of universal for most of the Miko line. When it comes to the 12-inch, gorgeous
really
figures.
Nice. I mean, I won't jump ahead, but there's some characters that every detail, it seemed like the little things on the uniforms and stuff, even though...
Well, let me just throw a small group that's genre related here. You have your Buck Rogers and your Black Holes.
And Buck Rogers' uniform was so tight, it was just as tight as Gil Gerard's actual costume in Buck Rogers. That's how perfect Miko went. That's how much detail they...
Oh, the guns were beautiful. Everything was beautiful on those larger ones, but the smaller ones... They just couldn't hold up, like you said, the faces were kind of blurry,
not as detailed. The faces seemed like they didn't have eyes and stuff. They had indentations for eyes, but they didn't go that extra effort to put eyes. With the Star Wars figures, even though they were basic faces and eyes and mouth and stuff, you still felt like they had life to them, where the other ones were just dead.
And you said the shiny. They were too shiny. They were like too glossy sometimes.
But now, like I said, we bounced around a little too quick. The Star Trek ones are great. The actual bridge crew, I really, really liked, and I still have them. They made aliens, which I do not have. I don't think I have anybody more than the Klingon, because they were actually pretty tough to find. And if they weren't tough to find, I just didn't get them. But I think they're pretty expensive, so they didn't make as many of the aliens of Star Trek, the motion picture.
Right. Now, let's just throw out there also, just because Star Wars, starts this whole bandwagon going, the company at the time still kept going strong with their traditional, doll-looking, about 7-8 inch long figures, tall figures. And because of television, they have a whole other realm of toys that they were still capitalizing from, but they were also dipping back and forth.
Well, they made Dukes of Hazzard, Mego style figures.
Yeah.
They made, I know Boss Hogg was one. They made
chips
of that larger size, and they made motorcycles for them to sit on, because I figured, we could still make a motorcycle size figure.
I've seen some pictures for Dallas.
Now, do we know they came out, or was that a promo?
I think they were promotional, and they never actually made it to the stores.
Yeah, I do recall hearing about them.
But there are pictures of them, because at the time...
That's another anomaly, like Alien, because that's an adult soap opera, on at 10 o'clock at night, and most kids wouldn't have been grabbing. Now, of course, everybody
wants to play Dallas?
Everybody knew Dallas, because when Who Shot JR came out, there was nobody on the planet who could have missed it. It still wasn't age appropriate.
But that's kind of like today somebody saying, I'm making Madman action figures. Yes, Madman is an incredible success, popular, highly rated show.
Very adult.
But I don't see kids playing Madman.
And Breaking Bad. I want the Walter action figure with his whole meth gear.
They actually do have those nowadays, but they're exclusively collector. It's a collector item. It's not a child item. Here's another one that I guess you could kind of say, maybe for kids, Love Boat.
They did make Love Boat figures.
Love Boat figures. Yes, they had 3 3/4.
Yeah, I do remember. But as crazy as this stuff is, nothing is more crazy than MASH action figures.
Okay, well, let's not blame Miko for that.
No, that was, was that LJN?
That was a company called TriStar.
Okay. And because they were ugly, they were kind of more like the Mego figures than the Star Trek Black Hole, Buck Rogers style. I have, as a goof, my father bought us, I think he bought John for my brother and Klinger for me. And it pops up every now and then, because I kept it I didn't ditch it or anything. I kept it with my action figure collection.
Again, we just mentioned inappropriate or unusual.
Didn't they make a Klinger in his lady outfit?
I think they had a whole mess of them there. But my point is, MASH had its comedy, but it also had its super serious, dramatic side that, oh my God, what are you going to recreate the season finale on with toys? The kid's going to end up with a psychologist.
I want to point out we're forgetting one really important line, which probably wasn't considered successful, sadly, but was awesome, and that was Indiana Jones.
Well, that's a Kenner.
But the Raiders of the Lost Ark figures that they made, and there were a couple of unproduced ones or hard to get ones, and they were slightly a derivative of Star Wars figures and this particular line called Butch and Sundance, the early days. We've mentioned it in the past. Some of the figures from Butch and Sundance had this gun drawing motion, and the hand had a bit of a spring in it. You'd pull it down, and you press a little lever or button, and his hand would pop up with the revolver in his hand to portray, a draw. So the Indiana Jones figure had that, in addition to, the whip, and he looked like he had his hat and everything. Really nicely packaged. They had some mail-away figures. They had some figures that were exclusive to certain sets.
But they were mainly Raiders, I believe, correct?
Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah. This is Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Right.
And they had some other, vehicles and some play sets and stuff. And I really liked that line. I didn't buy them all. And as a fan of, Indiana Jones, I wish I did have them all. I have Indy package still sealed. I was smart enough to have what I knew I liked sealed, but I wish I bought all of them, because nowadays you can find them pretty easily out of the package, and you probably won't go broke, but in the package you really have to throw out some money. Same thing with the Black Hole and Buck Rogers. I have them out of the package, mostly because my brother probably had custody of those. Mine was the Star Wars world, and he had this other stuff, but I basically grabbed them, as the years went on, so they wouldn't get lost or damaged.
Well, let me throw a couple of other memorable ones. Disney at the time, their answer to Star Wars was not only the Black Hole, but that later on, Tron.
The Tron figures was that Tomy?
That was Tomy, and there was those translucent colored ones.
They weren't terrible. The idea wasn't terrible because they tried to portray as if they were backlit or something, light coming through it.
Yeah. But that's kind of like saying, I'm going to make some Star Wars figures, but they're all going to be hologram blue translucents.
Yeah, they didn't go the extra mile and make the vehicles properly. They had SSP style light cycles, I believe.
Yeah, they did have some light cycles that you could pull the string, yeah.
The little thing, they were like the SSPs, if people even know what that code word means.
I'm sorry, they didn't have any figures that were actually like in the movie. In other words, the key characters where you could actually see their faces, painted, like black and white or gray and white.
I feel like they were basically making there were 4.
There was only 4.
Traditional kind of standard. There was probably a Sark looking guy. There was probably Tron and Flynn.
Tron and Flynn, the main bad guy, and his soldier.
Yeah. So that was a kind of weak set. And
yes,
a couple other ones. I mean, we're going to leave out a few because just lack of interest, but they attempted Michael Knight and the Knight Rider car.
Oh, well, don't worry. I got some more for you.
And the funny thing about that was they chose for some reason to make it's an American show with an American guy giving the voice that everybody knew who he was because he was also appearing on St. Elsewhere as an actor. And they chose to make the car available in Espanol. So somehow in the Northeast, the state of New Jersey must have been the only shipment of the Spanish ones, because my poor brother tried to get this car and we kept bringing it back. And every time we went through 3 of them till we actually found an American.
Oh, because it wasn't labeled? Like what language?
I mean, if it was poorly labeled. But this particular Toys R Us got him a steak package, I guess, then, and by the time he got it, he didn't even care. We just got our money back. So I don't even think that stayed in our house. But that was a pretty weak looking figure. I think it was Kenner, but it was just pretty lame.
Well, let me give you another one here. I don't know if you remember the movie Clash of the Titans.
Yes. Perseus, the Sam. That was,
it was a Ray Harryhausen film.
No, but the actor was Harry Hamlin.
Now, again, this is one of those situations where because the film wasn't that successful and they didn't make wave after wave, they only made one small wave of, I think, 4 or 5 figures, and that's it. And they're pretty cool little figures.
Yeah, I don't remember having any of those.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is Mattel we're talking about here. And when you open up the Mattel, box, out comes He-Man also.
That's a completely different scale.
Right, and they were different.
Because their muscular nature, they're probably more like in the 6-inch ballpark, but they're wide.
They're wide.
But they had a huge variety. They're still making them today for retro fans.
They come back every now and then. Mattel also had the original Battlestar Galacticas.
Well, those were almost as bad as you can get. And it's funny you mentioned
Except for the creatures.
I wanted them to be good. The Cylon is awesome.
Yeah.
The Lucifer is hard to find, also awesome.
Yeah.
The Imperious Leader was a weird character
What about
to begin with.
that 6-armed creature?
We don't know what he was, so we see him sitting up there. So when you see the figure, it's like he's like this blob. But they made Adama. The uniform is correct. The cloak is correct. The gun is correct. The head is kind of weak.
Yeah.
They make Starbuck. Well, Starbuck's very heroic, and that's a great figure to have. And they made Nadaga. Mm-hmm. Well, where's Apollo? He's an Apollo, also, if not the main star of the show.
But again, the show only lasts what, a season and a half, 2 seasons?
But they actually made a second wave. They made a gold Cylon.
Oh, yeah.
And then they made I think if Lucifer wasn't part of the second wave, there was an alternate Lucifer for one of the obscure episodes where there was another.
No Baltar?
Yeah, actually Baltar was part of the second wave and he looked good. I just don't understand how they never made it. I don't know if it was a contract thing.
Well, it has to be for the show. If the show disappears, the toys will disappear.
But Apollo should have been one of the first 4 figures.
Yeah. Well, the other one I don't want to say it's huge, but it is Mattel related. It was Mork and Mindy.
Well, that was awful because that one, I think he came sitting in an egg or something.
Oh, yeah. They came with egg. You could buy it.
I think I do have him. That I didn't buy. Somebody unloaded it on me and I said, yeah, I'll take it. I collect figures and I have it someplace just because.
Well, now, let me throw you another company, and this is a different way of approaching these is by companies because there's so many different toys and they're all interchangeable when it comes to what company actually made them. And sometimes these companies exchange hands. The license goes to one company, then it goes to another company. But the company called Galoob at the time was making, we're talking about.
They were awful. They were the worst ever.
The late 80s, the Star Trek Next Generation first wave of action figures.
Let's start a little earlier with those Galoobs. Boy, those things were crap. Those things, the Galoob figures, they look like they put them together with slave labor in China.
Well, which line are you talking about? The Star Trek line or previous to that?
Well, let's even use the Star Trek line. The paint jobs were awful.
Yeah.
I have all those.
The color was bad.
In fact, supposedly one that I have was, at the time the urban legend was this one's so valuable. I don't know why a mistake is so valuable. One? There was a speckly faced Data or something because they were trying to make him have that bit of a glimmer like Brett Spiner had his makeup to look like he was not human anymore. I had it and I thought it was just a screw up. And then I'm like, oh, well, maybe something comes out of it. The packaging was weak. It's just that whole nonsense was bad.
Right. Later on, like I mentioned before, when the license switches hands to Playmates, then they go crazy with them and they make them better looking.
Let's not go there far yet because that was one of the best lines of figures, I think.
And that lasted a long time.
Yeah, I think that was one of the best lines that was ever made. But there's still a few turkeys in the 80s that we haven't.
Well, if we go back to Galoob, let's talk about the A-Team.
Yeah, well, who knew that Galoob made the A-Team? But I think the best thing that came out of that was the van.
The van, it's very iconic. And it almost, to me, like if you think about it, even though it's a different company, you're thinking about the early 80s, you're thinking about Dukes of Hazzard, Chips, A-Team, they're almost like together.
They made the cars for them and the roof usually flipped up a little bit so you could stick a guy in. Uh-huh. And then, so they were kind of weak in the sense that, okay, the Dukes of Hazzard, the car is its own character and it was made out of this cheesy plastic that I recall a number of toys from that era were starting to be made, like Star Wars and Kenner. They kept the quality pretty good. In fact, I'd say the last toys were some of the best and still hardest to find because the quality was so good of the Skiff and the A-Wing and stuff. And then they come and they make this Dukes of Hazzard car, which is supposed to be a Charger. And it looks like it's got squashed. It looked more like a Challenger. Mm-hmm. Another thing Kenner attempted was Super Friends. And they made a pretty elaborate line in the middle 80s of superheroes from the Super Friends and, basically the good guys, the bad guys. Some of them were pretty obscure and only available in foreign countries or something like that. I remember they had a mail-away Darkseid or somebody like that. So it was like pretty deep into the DC Super Friends, superheroes world. They made a Batmobile. They might have made an Invisible Jet that was clear, but I don't know. Maybe I'm imagining that. And that was a pretty good line. It was a pretty strong line. That was out there around the same time as He-Man and, some of those kind of figures. One thing we've mentioned in the past that made copies of around, I guess, 86, 87 might have been the Kevin Costner Robin Hood. They made copies of the Ewok Village to make it look like Sherwood Forest, things like that. So, there's some good ones and there's some letdowns. I don't think anybody's banging down the door to get the Kevin Costner ones. Maybe some Kevin Costner fans, but I don't think any action figure fans are really clamoring for those.
Did they ever make any either like a Firehouse or EMT or cop-related action figures?
Yeah, well, back in the Mego days and the LJN days, they made emergency figures. I think they might have made SWAT. Whichever the Robert Urich was, I think they made. That was still in the 70s, though. Cop-wise, though, there's something that a lot of people don't remember, and we've mentioned in our Star Wars shows, but Fisher-Price came into the action figure scene, and they made Adventure People.
Oh, yeah.
And Adventure People, there were the little people, which were those round peg guys. Mm-hmm. They were for the littler kids, I'm actually surprised those don't have a bigger market for collectability because they made so many. They made Sesame Street style. They made all kinds of stuff. Play School made those. There were Weebles. again, another show, but that's that's a stuff for another show. But they were a big deal. But then when they made Adventure People, they made boats, they made city, they made cowboys, they made stuff like that. And I always thought that they were pretty well made, and then they kind of disappeared. I guess, they just grew out of fashion.
Right. Well, the other thing that we mentioned a little earlier when we were talking about the original G.I. Joes, while the 80s are happening, G.I. Joes go to the 3 3/4 scale, and they go for years.
They were enormous. That was about 1982, and that was an enormous line that went into the early 2000s and then stopped for a while and then came back, and it's out there still to this day. Some re-releases, some new stuff.
Right. And there were a lot of duds, as we said before. Somebody puts out a movie like Dune, for example. They come out with a wave of figures. The movie tanks. The figures go by real quickly. And that happened to a lot of
Dune figures that got rid of pretty quick. They made Star Trek. Star Trek the motion picture figures kind of were successful, but not really, compared to Star Wars, not really. Then they kind of skipped Star Trek 2. Then Star Trek 3 comes out. And there's the Star Trek characters looking like the red tunic type of things from the 80s Star Trek movies. Yeah. But they were terrible. That might have been Galoob. That might have been Galoob's earlier attempt, but I don't remember. I think I have some of them, but they're terrible. And they made little ships that were like metal. I guess they were their version of Hot Wheels ships. They were terrible as well. Like barely any detail.
Once we hit the 90s, things started changing. The McFarlanes, the NECs, all these companies that start creating these super detailed, super articulated, high-end figures, usually bigger than 3 3/4. They're usually about, maybe about 7, 8 inches tall.
Yeah, we're not going to mention everything because there's stuff we can't.
That is almost like a different chapter in the history of action figures. It revolutionized everything.
Well, the precursors to the McFarlane lines were the starting lineups, which started out in the late 80s as baseball and NFL players in the action figure size in their uniforms. But eventually they did hockey, basketball, NASCAR. They did different scales of that, large size, medium size. But, that's just another direction they went. Around the time, we're talking the Star Trek figures from Playmates, which to me is one of the finest lines out there. It's kind of been forgotten, but you bought them and opened them. We've got them on my side that none of them have been opened. Nothing has been opened. We've got some of the rare ones, the Red Data, a couple of these other rare ones. You've gotten some pretty rare ones that you were able to procure through eBay and things like that. Right. I mean, there's a movie out there called Free Enterprise, and they go on these toy runs in Toys R Us. If any fans, it basically is what our life was around college age. Going into Toys R Us trying to find action figures and laser discs. That was our big, I think that's represented in that movie. It's a good movie. Right. But that same company made Turtles, the Ninja Turtles.
Oh my God.
And those were huge as well.
Yeah.
That same company may or may not have. This might have been Kenner Ghostbusters figures. I remember there was the Ghostbusters movie, but they tried to translate it into a cartoon, which was kind of successful for a lot of the people a little bit younger than us. And they made a ton of those guys and different Slimers and cartoony versions of those guys.
Well, bringing everything back to where we started with these alien figures, these retro aliens. Who knows? Could this be a new trend in terms of companies specializing in what you would call retro figures? You have the super articulated stuff nowadays. We joked about it earlier, how Star Wars is going back to a 5-point of articulation line.
Let's come full circle. As great as all the figures got in the 2000s, it started to cost more, and the price of a figure went from the equivalent of, say, $5, $7 to now they're pushing $20 if you want those specialty type figures, and people aren't buying them. The sales are way down. So I guess as a reaction to the economy, they made them simpler again, the old days.
Especially those Star Wars ones. There's no reason to make them that simple anymore other than economics. They want to basically, in order to give you a toy that's $5, not $10, they have to eliminate articulation and detail.
Well, most of the sales probably throughout the 2000s, especially after the prequels ended, maybe around the time of maybe kids were still buying Clone Wars style. But I'd have to say most of the figures are being bought by adults or older kids who want them as collectibles and not necessarily toys to play with, with play sets and, every day, and shoot them up. Mm-hmm. But it's almost like these companies, some of them have put their finger up and given you an FU to the collectible people Because going back to these simplistic style figures is pretty weak, and they're packaging them in 2-packs and things like that. So it's like they don't really care.
Most of these companies, like Hasbro, for example, they acknowledge the fact that, yes, they do understand there's collectors out there and they spend a lot of money.
But that's how they made most of their money.
But their bread and butter is the kids, not the
When Star Wars
collectors.
came back, kids couldn't have kept that company going for all these years. So,
well, I don't know if it's a trend or a weird offshoot or just a fad.
Well, now we're back with retro figures.
Well, this particular company, the one that just produced these Alien figures, they're about to come out, and maybe this was their plan all along. Maybe their plan wasn't just to, I mean, it would be a pretty bad business plan.
The Alien figures was just a way to lure us in like a drug deal.
Right. I mean, it would have been a bad business plan if spending all this money to just produce one set of figures. No. Apparently, later this year, they're going to start putting out not a huge, gigantic line in terms of, 75 this or that. No. Just like they did with Alien, they're going to put out a series of original Terminator figures.
Here's how you know I'm old now, because I don't know what the pulse of life is or whatever the saying is, because I hate these figures. Go down the list of the stuff that they've announced.
Original Terminator.
They look awful.
Escape from New York.
He looks terrible. He looks completely terrible.
Well, the problem is that we're so used to seeing them really good now. That's the problem.
They're in the Star Wars style, but they're not even in the good quality. I'm hoping what we're seeing is all like,
prototypes?
Pre-production art.
Yeah. What I saw, again, I'm not looking to get every single one of them, but I would love to get like one Snake Plissken.
Snake Plissken could have been awesome. There's one with him wearing a jacket, and I don't even know.
There's with or without jacket.
It looks terrible. The one without the jacket looks like he's wearing suspenders or something. It's just kind of weird.
There's a Predator line. They're going to make some Predator figures.
The Predator's face looked awful.
Nightmare Before Christmas.
Those actually looked good, but I think they've done them better previously.
They've done them before, I think. So I don't know if that was particularly needed. There's a Rocketeer figure, which again, it's unusual because it's just one figure.
That's going to be like a niche kind of thing, because there's some people who still find that movie fascinating. I thought it was well made. I saw it in the theater and all that, but I don't need to go back to it.
Now, they also have a list here, no pictures yet, but they are going to do a couple of, apparently, out of all things in the world, Pulp Fiction figures.
Another kid-friendly film.
And one of them is the GIMP, believe it or not. Back to the Future, they're going to create some Back to the Future figures. Halloween, Friday the 13th.
Those will sell because there's a rabid group of fans, just like we are with Star Wars.
The horror stuff, yeah. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Goonies.
Buffy's about 10 years too late, but maybe there'll be people who go back to it.
The Crow, Firefly. Hellraiser, again, if you're into that horror stuff.
I don't tap into that, but I think the people are very loyal who buy that stuff and will love that line.
There's a series of Universal Classic Monsters in that style. And again, keep in mind, these all carded, as if you bought them 30 years ago.
Could Frankenstein get any stiffer than to be made into a figure that looks like it's Star Wars style?
I don't know. Let's see, the Ghostface from Scream, Trick or Treat. That's a horror movie. But yeah, it looks like they're experimenting. Now, what's funny about these lines, and this is the last thing I'm going to mention, I swear, is that throughout the years, I've been noticing, and this is going to lead us to a different show we're going to be doing in the future. There's a lot of people out there, through the magic of technology and printing and how good you can print things out of the internet and pictures and screen grabs and stuff
just the growth of really talented artistic people.
If you go on eBay, you can find custom made action figures
of anything,
of just about every movie you can think of. Now, granted, these are custom made. These are not very, they're not incredibly good looking because they're all homemade. Somebody's kit bashing, the head of a G.I. Joe.
Some of them are incredibly good looking.
Right. The head of a G.I. Joe, the body of a Ben Kenobi, the arms of this or that to come up with a certain character. And then they're carding them. And then they're sealing them in a bubble in the card and selling them as custom made figures.
And that card, that extra bit, that extra length really is impressive because the figure can be average just sitting on your shelf or whatever. But you add the card.
It looks like it just came out of a factory.
Yeah, that impresses me a lot, and I've seen a number of people do things like that are good. They do it sometimes with Hot Wheels or various other kind of cards.
They're not cheap. You pay quite a bit of money for them, and I have a feeling maybe that's happening now. Some of these companies are noticing that people are going into eBay and buying these things to say, you know what? Let's do them for real, and let's do them a little better looking, and let's give them the whole package. So maybe that's what's happening with these action figures.
Yeah.
So, I'm a little more optimistic than James about what these things look like. I'm definitely not getting them all, but I wouldn't mind picking up one here or there, especially with the art. I really like the art they use on some of these cards. So I would like to thank James for joining me today. And hopefully we'll do a couple more shows like this where we, explore a little deeper into our all these interesting vintage toy lines that we used to not necessarily collect. I mean, some of them we just kind of had to pass them because there were so many of them out there, like we mentioned before. And the movie comes out, 3 or 4 figures will come out, and the other thing is that you don't want to start investing in something that then peters out and goes nowhere.
Well, theoretically, I guess you should like what you're buying, not just buying for the sake of saying, oh, it might be worth something.
Oh, well, yeah.
That's how most people should really look at it, because you'll probably miss a few winners that you leave on the shelf. Like I recall leaving the 18-inch Alien doll on the shelf because I didn't see the movie yet, and it was kind of scary looking.
And it was very well made. It still holds up as far as I'm concerned.
A couple $100 you can have it from eBay.
No kidding. So, anyway, thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you here next time at GeekFest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
From the Black Hole Collection, it's Vincent.
Look, a black hole in space!
And Captain Dan Holland. It's the Black Hole action figures, each sold separately. You can pretend the evil Dr. Reinhardt and Maximilian want to force Captain Holland and Vincent into the Black Hole.
All clear, Captain.
Other Black Hole action figures sold separately. Maximilian, Captain Holland, Vincent, and all Black Hole action figures sold separately by Mego.
Stop! That's not funny.